Hello everyone, I'm Michael, and today, I'm going to tell you a story. Nurses of Reddit. What were the most haunting things someone said on their deathbed? Story 1. Not a nurse. Was an EMT on the 911 unit that got a call about hit and run. Cops were on scene first. The area of the city I worked in was rough. Some guy and his head got into a fight in the parking lot. It ended with the guy running over his, then backing up over her. Needless to say, she wasn't doing well, and her vitals were tanking. We loaded her up, with a fireman and police officer joined with us in the back of the rig. She kept mumbling, "Tell my mom. Please tell my mom," and naturally I figured it was her asking us to let her mom know she was hurt. The hospital takes care of that, and I put it out of my mind rather quick as we were working over her. She flatlined before we arrived. They did not get her back. My partner was finishing up her paperwork, and we turned to give her wallet back to the staff. The nurse on duty, who I knew pretty well, was reading a dirty piece of paper. She looked disgusted. When I asked what was up, she simply put the piece of paperwork down. It was a letter that was picked up near her purse on scene. She had gotten accepted into a college. I realized then that in the ambulance, she was asking us to tell her mom she got into college. That is a deep sadness I have never forgotten. Story 2. So this happened a couple of years ago. We had an ex-gang guy who was dying of cancer, and he confessed that he was the gang hitman for many years. He wanted to confess to all the killings and show the police where the bodies are buried. He would get closure, knowing that the surviving families of his victims find out where they are buried. We had to get the hospital legal team involved cause we had no policies to deal with that. Cops got involved and the dude confessed gang murders from decades ago. Story 3. I had a patient whose memory had been fading for years. It's weird, right before a patient dies, sometimes they'll suddenly be doing a lot better. Anyway, he thought I was his late wife. I played along and just listened to him while he recalled his engagement, his wedding, his first childbirth, and a few other memories for me. At one point, he says, "Oh, Irene, there you are. Sorry, you know my eyes aren't as good as they used to be." Well, thank you for listening to an old man tell his stories. I hope you have great stories to tell one day too. I'm coming, Irene, and then he passed. He was my first long-time patient. Story 4. I'm not a nurse, but I provided hospice care for a loved one so she could die in her own home rather than a hospital. At the end, she became convinced that taking morphine for the pain was killing her. She would lay in agony asking me for help, but refused the pain meds. I resorted to just raising and lowering her bed to help her get comfortable. The day she died, her cat went from being aloof to sleeping on the bed with her. Cats know things. Story 5. I had to tell my grandmother that dialysis would only give her another week or so to live, and it was her choice to try or not. She was in and out of consciousness at that point, and was in a clear state for the moment. She asked, "Will I die?" I said, "Yes." She looked me in the eye and smiled just a little and said, "Sometimes you gotta do what you don't want to do." She closed her eyes, squeezed my hand, and slept until she passed a day later. When things get hard, I always hear her say, "Sometimes you gotta do what you don't want to do." Story 6. Not a nurse, but my grandfather was put into a 24/7 care home with severe Parkinson's. My mom and grandma had spent 4 years basically taking care of him constantly, and needed a break for a couple weeks, although visiting him every other day in shifts. I went one day alone and he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I need you to get me home so I can die. I can't do it here." I tried saying everything I could to the nurses and my family to get him home without saying what he told me. 24 hours later, he got rushed to emerge. As he was dying, he looked at me and said, "Don't let it bother you," and died. Still bothers me. Story 7. My grandmother was diagnosed with lung cancer and began treatment. About halfway through, she sat everyone down and told us she felt her life was so fulfilled and would stop treatment, essentially choosing to pass peacefully. My grandfather was healthy, the type of man who went to the gym until he was 90. Just in impeccable shape and health, honestly. My grandmother was on her deathbed for a long while, in and out of consciousness, no longer communicating often, and only eating iced chips. It really tore my grandfather up, and one day, he was at the grocery store and just had a heart attack and passed away within minutes. A few days later, my dad and I were sitting with my grandmother in her room. I was holding her hand and remember my dad telling her my grandfather is waiting for her whenever she is ready, and she won't have to go alone. My grandmother spoke her first words in a week and said, "He's right here with me. I see him." My dad said, "What's he wearing?" Which at the time I thought it was an odd question, but she giggled and said, "He's in my favorite gray suit. I think we're going out." She was such a fashionable woman, so they always were so well dressed. She passed that evening. We had their funeral together, and my dad dressed him in the suit she told him my grandfather was wearing. They were so in love, still to this day. I have never seen anyone compare to what they had. A part of me feels my grandfather died of a broken heart, but also knew she needed him onto their next journey. It tears me to pieces every time I think of her last words. I know they're happy and together. I miss them both so much. The world is a little dimmer without them. Story 8. I worked as a nurse's aide in a nursing home for just 2 months, brand new. This gentleman was assigned to my caseload the entire time I had worked there, and was on hospice the whole time, but had seemed to be doing well. This night, I was working with him and he seemed off. I talked to him and explained what I was doing to care for him, but he just sounded so angry and confused. I was new to this, so I didn't know quite what to do, so I pressed on. He got so freaked out, he took his oxygen tubing and tried to wrap it around my throat to strangle me. I got away, told the nurse, and was told that confusion and aggression were common when people were dying. He needed his care regardless. I went to care for him again a few hours later, and he looked so docile, so defeated. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at me and told me, "I'm real sorry for what I did earlier, ma'am. That's not who I am." "I'm so sorry," I told him. It was okay, and that I just wanted to make him comfortable. He thanked me and said the line, "I'm going home." He just kept repeating it and sounded so urgent. "I'm going home. I'm going home. I'm going home," I thought. He was still confused. He passed away 1.5 hours later, right after my shift was over. I was the one to hear his last words. Upon learning that he passed away, I immediately thought of those last words. Sticks with me to this day. This was almost 12 years ago, and I don't think I'll ever forget. Story 9. My great-uncle's last words before he passed were, "It is what it is." I know it's really common, but I find myself saying it quite a lot nowadays. It is what it is. My great-aunt, who lived to be 101, was straight vegetative for like a month or so before passing, the day after her 101st birthday. On the day of her birthday, she suddenly was conscious and awake as everybody had come to leave a birthday cake. She told stories and laughed. Then she went back to being comatose and died the next day. Woman loved her birthday lol. Story 10. I was with a 20-year-old who took his own life. He checked into a nice hotel and his parents reported him missing. Anyways, they found out he was in a hotel by a credit card charge. I was the responding officer, and when I arrived, I knocked on the door. He answered, and was really cool. We chatted for a few minutes and I asked him if he was willing to come downstairs to meet with his parents. He went back into his room, and I held the door open. It appeared he was putting on a jacket, but he pulled out a gun, placed it on his temple and said, "Fuck my family, this is on them," and pulled the trigger. First time someone mauled themselves in front of me, and wasn't the last. That shit haunts you years later. Story 11. Many moons ago, when I was a nursing student, a man in his 40s was lying on his deathbed from terminal cancer, his sobbing wife lying in bed next to him. He looked at his wife, using the last bit of energy. He had to gently wipe away her tears and stroke her cheek. He took off his oxygen mask and said, "Don't worry, love. Don't be afraid. It's just death," and passed shortly after. Story 12. From when I worked in private practice. Had a patient get diagnosed with a moderately aggressive, but treatable, throat cancer. We tried everything we could think of to get him to consider treatment. He refused any type of treatment, so after about 3 months, his wife had their 2 adult sons basically carry him into the office at 4:50 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. I was the only nurse in the building. I got him into an exam room. Dude was completely gray, gaunt, and you could hear how close the end was every time he breathed. It wasn't exactly a death rattle, but you just knew his lungs were full of fluid. His son sit him in a chair, and he starts to slide out. The room was too small to put him on the floor, and the exam table was too high to lift him up on it. I stood between his legs and held him upright in the chair while I told the sons to go get the doctor, told the wife to call 911. We all knew nothing was going to keep the man alive much longer. He patted the side of my leg It was the most he could move, and whispered, "I should have listened to you all. I don't want to die." He lost consciousness and all I could do was just keep him from sliding out of the chair until the EMTs got there. After the ambulance got him to the hospital, he lasted about 4 hours. Story 13. I'm so late to the party here, but I want to share this. I had a rough life. After decades of pain and mistakes, I met this amazing woman. Her family was split on me. Some thought I was a bad choice. Some really liked me because I was at the very least brutally honest with myself. My wife's grandmother loved me instantly with a love I had rarely experienced in my life. She truly was a driving force in my wife's family accepting me. She was a real firecracker. She'd lived good, had a big family, a great husband. You could see in her eyes from the day I met her she was content with life. She went in and out of hospice, but the last time, the whole family was there. She was completely coherent, awake, sassy as ever. I stopped by to show my love, and I'll never forget. All the kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, family friends were hanging around casually like it was just another day, and Grandma was a tank, so we all knew she'd go home soon. I had to leave to pick up my boys from school. The wife was staying. I made my way through the crowd and gave her a kiss. We locked eyes and had a conversation of a million words in a few seconds of eye contact. She saw my soul and I promised her I'd take care of her granddaughter. I feel like I walked out of the room backwards. Like a movie. Everyone else was doing something else and talking to everyone other than her. She had this twinkle in her eye, and I couldn't look away. She told me she loved me in that look in a way I hadn't received love much in my life. I felt her soul hug me. I knew. She knew. I knew that she knew that no one else knew. She winked at me when I went past the door. I knew. I made it around the corner of the hallway and cried for the long drive home. My wife called me an hour or so later saying she had passed unexpectedly. I still feel like my wife's grandma, who was surrounded by a massive family that was close and full of love, gave me one of her last glances to tell me I was loved, like I hadn't been much in my life. I see that love in my wife's eyes every day. Story 14. When I was 16, I worked as a dietary aide in a pretty nice nursing home. There was this one older gentleman that I became pretty good friends with. He always talked about WW2 and how he had lost so many guys in his company. Several days in a row I had noticed that he wasn't coming down to the dining room for lunch or dinner. Went to his room to check on him, and he wasn't there. The nurse said he had a spell and fell out of his bed. His doctor wanted him to go to the hospital for observation. What had really happened is he had a stroke. He got back to the nursing home about a week later, and he really couldn't remember anyone except for me. We talked the day after he got back, and he told me he wasn't doing good. He knew his time was coming to a close. Said it was time for him to pay for all the horrible things he had done when he was over in Europe. He wasn't a religious man, but he asked me where I thought he was going. I said to bed because it's getting close to lights out. He said, "No, Joe, who? My name is Mike. I mean up or down." Now, I'm not a deeply religious person either. But I said, "Martin, that's not for me to say." He laughed and said, "I know where I'm going. There's only one place for people who have done what I've done. I've killed so many people, Joe. Most of the time it didn't matter who it was. We went into buildings just shooting. There's only one place for me. It's what I deserve." I had absolutely nothing to respond with. When I say that experience shook me to the core, I really mean it. That man's face is burned into memory because of that conversation. He passed away the next day. His son said he kept asking where Joe was at. I quit that day. Working in a nursing home is a haunting place. Takes a special type of person to be able to watch people just die around you. Story 15. Looked after a guy with end-stage heart failure. He kept having episodes where if he coughed or leaned forward, anything to increase his intrathoracic pressure, he would pass out. He would come back after a few minutes and gradually go from purple back to pink. How long was I out for that time? He was fully mentally fine, sharp, witty and at peace with what was going to eventually happen to him. Him and me were joking that one of these episodes were going to kill him, as he sipped his tea and we talked rubbish. 5 minutes later it happened again, and he didn't come back. He had a DNR order, which was sensible. Very eerie to talk to somebody so vibrant and alert minutes before he died. Such a nice dude. I want to be in that mindset when I go to. Story 16. Physical therapist here. I treated a man in his 90s who was a DNI. At least once a week when I would go to his room to start our sessions, he would cry and say, I didn't want to kill the kids. After speaking to his nurse, it was revealed that he had killed children in WW2. He collapsed during a session and said the kids are here to get me. He died a few minutes later. Story 17. I didn't mean to. We were sending this middle-aged guy home after his year visit. As soon as we moved him off the bed, he went unresponsive and had no heartbeat. We did a couple rounds of CPR, and he began to come to. He blinked a couple times and the doctor running the code jokingly said, Sir, you almost died on us. The man said, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to in a sad way. His heart then stopped again and we couldn't get him back. Since a lot of you are asking, it was most likely a saddle pulmonary embolism. He was there for something pretty mild, but he threw a clot right when he was being transferred. If you want to look it up, he had classic cape cyanosis across his chest, which is indicative of a big P. Story 18. I started my nursing career on a palliative unit. In my first 3 months as a RN, I pronounced 7 deaths. This one patient had advanced dementia and often believed he was at work while he was awake in the hospital. He would often give us, the nurses and care aides, tasks and jobs to do, as he believed himself to be our superior. One day near the end of December, he asked me, when is New Year's? What day is it this year? I tell him New Year's will be the upcoming Tuesday. He nods and tells me that he thinks he's going to have to quit after the new year. This job is getting too difficult for him, and he can't keep up. It's time to retire. I tell him we appreciate all the hard work he's done and will miss him terribly when he's gone, that he was a great employee, and we all love working with him. That Tuesday, January 1st, he passed away peacefully in his sleep at 200. I will never forget that conversation. Story 19. Short story, but we had a young patient years ago. She had a history of the fourth drug use, had gotten sober a few months ago, but had developed endocarditis, infection of her heart, and had vegetation on her valves, as well as severe heart failure from dirty needles. She needed months of antibiotics, and then would be eligible to get a VAD, ventricular assist device, machine to bypass her heart and possibly bridge her to a transplant after being sober long enough. She had already been on the unit over a month. She was quiet, sweet, and reserved, but always thankful for her care. She had no social support. Her mother was who gave her drugs the first time, and she had no contact with anyone in her life except for one friend, who came in once a week to check on her. On her 24th birthday, we got her a cupcake and sang her happy birthday. We hung a banner in her room, got her little presents, some games to play in the hospital, and adult coloring books. She said thank you, but didn't show a lot of emotion. She was always quiet, and we were not entirely sure how she felt at the time. That day, on her birthday, she went into cardiac arrest and died. We spent 45 minutes trying to get her back. Her friend came in to collect her things and showed us the message she sent her that day. It had a picture of the cupcake, presents, and banner and said, I love my nurses. I don't know how to tell them, but they're the best family I've ever had, she did tell us in the end. I'll never forget her. I cried on and off the entire rest of my night shift. Story 20. My dad was in the hospital and found out he had lung cancer. It was him, my stepmom, and a nurse in the room. He told my stepmom to get him something just to get her to leave the room. The nurse said that before she could stop him, he took off his oxygen mask, said, I'm done, and he lost consciousness immediately. He was on life support for a day or so, but he was already gone. When we pulled the plug, his body died in less than 5 minutes. I guess he really was done.